Howdy, friends. Welcome to Space Café. Welcome to Black Ops by Ralph Thiele. You are invited to ride with us the space wave with LEOs and NEOs. Hundreds and thousands of very capable satellites are about to travel to space, ready to engage. We will discuss with thrilling guests implications for security and defense. Join us for 60 minutes. We count on you.
I'm Thorsten Greening, publisher of SpaceWatch.Global, and we are a Switzerland-based online platform for information in and about space and new space activities in a geopolitical context. I know many of you are already familiar with our website, our bi-weekly and daily newsletters, and the Space Café podcast. We also keep our fan shop open online for you, where you can support us actively and become a space watcher. And I have to jump a bit today, because I'm using another microphone. Edition 1 has cool mugs, awesome t-shirts, and some cool items for you, your friends, and the ones you love. Your support is needed to keep our work alive, and we do that for you. If you have missed any of our previous web talks, we have an archive available on our webpage in the events section or on YouTube. And now, ladies and gentlemen, my job is done for the moment, and it's my pleasure to hand over to your host today, Ralph Thiele. Ralph, over to you.
Thank you, Thorsten. Hello, everybody. Howdy, everybody. Good to have you on board on this number 3 of Black Ops by Ralph Thiele. It's a wonderful day out there, sun shining and fitting to space as we are taking on this issue. I'm not sure, but some of you may have read President Joe Biden's interim national security strategic guidance, and you will have learned, if not to read it, please, how important technology is for our future in every way. In principle, geostrategic competition is global in scope, it's fluid, and space has a particular role in it. Obviously, in space, the cat is out of the bag. Clearly, space technologies are among the technologies of the moment, as their thoroughly revolutionary implementation is already in the rollout phase. So this is where we are, and for those who follow the discussions, you'll learn that the competitors try to outpace, outthink, outmaneuver the others while they implement new technologies and competition to space. We have a wonderful guest today here. Welcome, Dr. Robbie Samantha Roy. Robbie, welcome to have you on board. Robbie is Vice President Technology at Lockheed Martin. He comes with a really remarkable, impressive background, not only in Lockheed Martin, where he has developed and provided technical intelligence strategy for the corporation. He was engaged in science and technology ecosystem. He has fostered cross-enterprise innovation. So he knows all the business in principle at Lockheed Martin. And not only that, before he has been in the professional staff member with the Senate Armed Services Committee. He has been in the White House Office of Science and Technology. So this is a real moment where we can expect many news and many backgrounds we haven't had before. So again, welcome Robbie on board. Robbie, as we look now at the scope, I think we should start in line with the president, more or less at the geostrategic environment. President Biden has described the world at an inflection point, a moment of accelerating global challenges. And of course, the question is, how do these challenges relate to outer space, Robbie?
Well, first of all, Ralph, thank you very much for inviting me and this opportunity to talk about this very fascinating, very interesting, subject. So this is a very interesting question that really, captures a lot of different, attributes and dimensions to space, which makes it very fascinating. Because on one hand, you have the geostrategic political situation. but you also have the growing commercial industry involvement. And then ultimately, you obviously have a high technology component to it. And so it's really this mixture of all these things that really are fascinating. As you had mentioned, I have the honor of, working for Lockheed Martin, which is, we sometimes call it the company of the hundreds. We have over 100,000 people. We're over 100 years old. Our market capital is about $100 billion. And we basically build products that span all of these various domains, including space, where we've been active since the beginning of the space age. And so I think the heart of this question really boils down to is, the role that space and humanity have played, where they have historically, and where are they going? As you know, the whole space race in the Cold War was really a competition between the U.S. and Western allied nations, and the Soviet Union and its allies. And it was a race for who was going to go into space, who was going to get to the moon, etc. But it was in an environment where still space was viewed as sort of a high ground or a sanctuary, where, obviously nation states would have military activities, but it wasn't a domain where there'd actually be conflict. I think what you're seeing here is from the Biden administration, and also even the previous Trump administration, is a growing acknowledgement that, space is becoming an environment and a domain where, very unfortunately, it will be contested. And there will be activities that will require, nation states to engage where they have for millennium, in terms of, military activities. Now, this really runs counter to the fundamental principles that the U.S. has always espoused from the very beginning of space activities, going back to the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. And so I think that's really the interesting dynamic if you look at the U.S.'s position, working very closely with its allies in a very strong transatlantic, partnership, and with the UN of trying to preserve space to be that sanctuary where you have freedom of operation, etc., and you're not going to have contested environments. But at the end of the day, I think, Ralph, the history of humanity is that wherever humans go, where there's commerce, there ultimately will be conflict, and I think that's very unfortunate. But at the end of the day, it is one of the realities, and why this administration is acknowledging that space will potentially be this domain that we have to really worry about. And so I think at the end of the day, the other element of it's very important for nations to come together with the rules of the road, and from a diplomatic perspective to really understand that there are guidelines and best practices that will help to try to avoid conflict.
Yeah, thank you, Robbie. Space for a long time, in principle, has been in the realm of governments. This has obviously changed. I recall that more or less 75% of space is now more or less commercially run, right? Amazing. And yet, in principle, it has been a niche area of tech investment so far. Now, as we see already, a couple of billionaires getting engaged in space, these times possibly are over. So we will see more tech investments involved in the future.
Oh, absolutely. As you know, Ralph, I mean, space has been, because of the harsh environment, the high performance parameters required for whether it's launch, operation in space, return of spacecraft back, re-entry, when you're going, Mach 25 and thousands of degrees, Fahrenheit, all of these interesting elements really have pushed the frontiers of technology. So there is nothing new that high technology has been a very, very important component of advancements of humanity in space operations. Now, what you've observed is obviously that in the beginning, it was the role of governments to basically fund a lot of these fundamental research and development activities. And, whether it was advanced electronics, whether it's advanced materials, communications, etc. But, during the course of, if you will, as research and development expands and the commercial sector gets more involved, a lot of these activities now have diffused into the commercial, the industrial sector. And, what one of my former colleagues, has observed sometimes is that governments sometimes are really, they're there to help invent things, to help fund the development or the invention of things. But sometimes they're the last to actually, adopt or innovate. And so that gap is the role of industry to help take some of these inventions that are funded by the government and laboratories and universities and essentially mature them in commercial technologies to a point where the government can actually now, bring back into applications. And so that's not something that's new, because if you look at, for instance, how the aviation sector, basically developed over time, a lot of the early developments and research that, at least in the U.S. by the NACA, right, the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, really funded a lot of fundamental technology that ultimately made it into, at that time, the Boeings, the Lockheeds, the Northrops, and those various, if you will, companies then took that to the next level. So I think that's sort of the natural progression, if you will, of technology development. So I think it's exciting. And I think it's just, ultimately inevitable that, the commercial sector will start to take these technologies, mature them, go into different directions that, we never really have envisioned early on when these things were invented. So thank you.
Well, now we are with a hot issue in principle with the technologies. When you look at those, it's not just one or two in principle, it's a whole bunch of technologies that are hitting us, our societies, our industries, and of course also the space industry. So it's quite a challenge that we have to look at now. How would these new disruptive technologies hit, in principle, the space business as I speak to it? And I would love you to discuss perhaps in particular cyber, artificial intelligence. As a former military, I'm really concerned about the possibilities of cyber these days, and of course to learn also from you what that means to our space assets out there.
Right. So again, these are great questions, Ralph. And so I think you've just mentioned, a couple of very interesting, technologies, or actually technical areas that are starting to have a very profound influence in the space community. From a technology perspective, early on there was a lot of funding and activity, right, for just the foundational things like propulsion and launch vehicles and spacecraft buses and power, solar arrays, things that would be able to withstand the harsh environment of space. But, that's really sort of at the platform level. Now we are in a digital and an information age. And now really where the strength of where space comes in as a domain, where many companies, where many governments are going, is essentially, space is a domain where you can collect information from, you can transmit information from, and ultimately turn, data or information that you collect into something that is useful, whether it's remote sensing, for agriculture, they're looking at weather for the importance of monitoring, the health of the planet. All of these various things are very important. And so now that we're focusing on information and data, a lot of, again, these technologies that were invented by essentially, governmental research and development activities, now that have been matured in the commercial sector, are now being pulled back. So for instance, when it comes to elements, for instance, like how do we deal with all of this data? So for instance, as an example with Lockheed Martin, I mean, we have, really embraced it with some of our experimental and R&D research activities, things like how do you build small satellites that can work in swarms? And how can they basically take a cloud computing environment that we're all very familiar with on the ground and put it into space so that you don't have to worry so much about the data links, that you can do now more at the edge computing. In fact, we've been working with some universities and with some of the leading AI companies like NVIDIA to put the leading graphic processor units on basically research satellites working with academia and seeing what can you do actually with the data processing for machine learning, etc. So I think artificial intelligence really is, there's a big wave of the future of how to handle and sift through essentially a sea of data that you collect and will be processing. So that's very important. And so the developments that are taking place on the ground that are really fundamentally changing the way we do work, we do business, even the national security sector, that inevitably is taking place, within the space domain, both in space and spacecraft, as well as on the ground for all the ground processing, image detection, image analysis, etc. On the cyber side, obviously, once you start to worry about taking data transfers from and to space, within space, you're now worrying about all the vulnerabilities and all of the elements that we deal with here terrestrially, right? And so space just becomes another domain where we're exchanging and transporting information. And so the resiliency, the vulnerabilities that need to be addressed. I mean, you've seen many very widely publicized the cyber vulnerability events, and so that's an area where we really have to worry about. And again, this is an area, for instance, Lockheed Martin, as well as many other companies are essentially focusing on to ensure that we can have a very robust, disciplined approach to how we cyber secure, harden, and ensure that the data is going to be safe and resilient. And the last thing I'd probably mention on that front, Ralph, is that there's a lot of commercial activity that goes on in this arena, and it's not just the realm of governments or the large aerospace and defense companies. And so we are very active in the venture capital space. We have actually a venture capital arm called Allen Ventures. It's about a $200 million evergreen fund. And we go and we actively participate with and invest in companies that have some of these leading technologies that we can bring in. And so AI and cyber are a couple of areas where are very exciting, but as you pointed out, are very critically important for essentially the safe, effective operation of space to come.
May I follow the cyber issue up with an additional question? In principle, I recall when this thing started on the governmental side, 2012, 2013, there were pretty many pretenders out there. I don't want to name them, but everybody said we can do that. And we found then later on that was not so easy. Is that now better structured, this market? So do the players know who's really professional and capable and who is not? How would you consider the situation at the moment?
Well, I think the cyber situation still continues to evolve. I think, Ralph, it's very interesting to go back to a little bit of the history of the internet, right? I mean, what's fascinating about the year 1969 is, that's when the first Apollo mission, right? Apollo 11 lands on the moon. But many people don't remember that 1969 was also the year when there was the first message that was actually transmitted on the early origins of the internet. At that time, it was called ARPANET. And it's kind of an interesting joke that, the first message was supposed to be login. And so the letter L, the letter O went over, and then the whole system crashed. So look how far we've gotten, on the internet since 69, and look how far we've gotten in space. It's fascinating. So my point is that those early days of the development of the internet, quite frankly, did not really fully appreciate and project where security considerations would come into play. And so there's been a lot of, if you will, development since then to try to, I would pick, quite frankly, to put Band-Aids on the way that the internet, operates and to really try to evolve our security. But at the end of the day, this includes Lockheed Martin, you have to take a very robust systems engineering perspective and looking at all the entire chain of data creation, storage, transmission, and to ensure that there's not one of the weakest links that will make your entire system, vulnerable. So at the end of the day, the ecosystem has definitely matured. Essentially the implications, if you are weak in this area, are profound from an economic perspective, a personal identity perspective, a national security perspective. And so, but what I would just leave with, Ralph, is this still, at the end of the day, what's interesting is when you look across how you evaluate cybersecurity, there are still some really interesting research questions, outgoing research questions that we are involved in, government laboratories, and it really boils down to just fundamentally, very simply, the following. If you're going to test let's say a spacecraft and say, how good is it going to do its specifications of performance? Well, you can test its range, you can test its payload, you can test very certain physical parameters and see where you're good to go. For a cybersecurity system, how do you really determine how safe it is? Because you only know about the known vulnerabilities. There's always unknown vulnerabilities. And furthermore, processes of how you test these things usually rely upon red teams. And so now it becomes a bit of a challenge between how good is the red team breaking into your system, right?
Yes.
So there really is, the bottom line is that there's still the science of cybersecurity, of how to quantifiably define how secure a system is. This is a fascinating research question that still is we're going to, basically occupy us for some time to come.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Now, turning to the ecosystem with which you construct, in principle, space capabilities. When I look again from the military side, in principle, the party has grown. So, of course, we have these lead system integrators like Lockheed Martin on board, and they are very necessary to have these lead system integrators to understand the complexity and make all the ingredients work. But you have more and more complete newcomers coming on board. I just saw Palantir, just to name one, the other day that does a lot of data evaluation. You have tiny startups that come with great ideas. All of them want to earn money. Government are attractive in terms of masses of money as they come, although in Europe it's a little bit different than from the US. Yet they are slow. And so the challenge is, in a way, to take on the dynamics of innovation also outside the classical defense markets and arrange a kind of ecosystem where you can take advantage of innovation and integrate it so that it actually does the job it's supposed to be in a multi-domain environment that we are going forward to. So how do you foresee this interaction between the commercial side and the classical military side with regard to these markets that also grow together, the civil markets, the commercial markets, the civil markets, defense markets. So it's, I think, an undertaking we're in at the moment, and where certainly you will have some thoughts on how that could work, how that should work.
Absolutely. So that's a really great question. So to really frame that, Ralph, I mean, if you look at some of the some of the studies, like there's a analytical company in the U.S. called Bryce Space that kind of puts out these projections of how much money goes into a commercial sector. There's like these numbers out there, like $366 billion like in 2019. So we are talking about a huge economic ecosystem. And the development of having these new sort of non-traditional companies that are leveraging, as I said, innovations that have been made in the commercial sector, especially in information technologies, the whole sort of the digital environment. This is what is great and makes the whole ecosystem more vibrant. And it's really the marriage, it's the partnership between these smaller companies and large leading systems integrators like a Lockheed Martin that have a lot of history. They have a lot of lessons learned of what to do or what not to do. Hard lessons learned from operating in space for decades. Not only on the Earth, but even we've been to Mars now like over a dozen times. So it's that interaction which is going to be really important. And so we have, embraced things like, for instance, even how the U.S. Defense Department has done is to basically develop mechanisms, how we can make it easier to interact, to partner, to invest, to bring in these technologies. And so, for instance, as I mentioned, again, our LM Ventures, arm, we also have something called the Lockheed Martin Innovation Partnership, our partners, where we work with our venture capital, we work with some of the entities or organizations within the U.S. government that are focused on dealing with, Silicon Valley or Austin or Boston, these really, innovation hubs of the startup communities where venture capital, private equity, is very active. And we partner to be able to bring in these technologies. So there's small companies like, Tyvek, which, has already launched over like 200 small satellites. We have formed a great partnership with them. We were one of some of the early investors in Peter Beck's, rocket launch company in New Zealand, ABL, in Europe. And so I think the end of the day is that it's very important that, what we try to do successfully within Lockheed Martin, what happens in the government, is to scout, to be aware of these emerging technologies. And then what's most important, what people talk about, it's this valley of death. How do you take some new interesting technology and then be able to cross this valley of, it's an interesting widget, but now how do you turn it into something of value, where it now ultimately goes into a product, into a system, into a service that ultimately is useful. And so I view this, this rich ecosystem, this interaction between the government, funding things, and large companies like a Lockheed Martin working with these smaller companies and being able to more rapidly. That's the whole issue now today is an issue of speed. We do not have the luxury of waiting for decades to do these things. We've got to be able to do them, in a much faster timeline.
Yeah, this is in fact a challenge that you could really dive even deeper in. Looking at your background, I just see not just the B2, but also the hypersonic missile. In our last session, in fact, where we were dealing with quantum, we were also discussing the hypersonics and the threats that are coming to us. And in fact, I just did a study on hybrid warfare and future technologies, and the hypersonics were among the most worrisome developments we have in the past. And what worries even more, in a way, is that to see them already as a capability on the Russian and Chinese side, while in the late development phase of the US side. So there is some challenge there, and I think there's even more challenge with regard to defense. So what can we do to defend against incoming hypersonic threats? Space obviously has a role in it. So may I ask you what you see in both in the challenge as well in the opportunities to deal with these challenges that you could offer?
Absolutely. So let me really stick to the technology side, because I think that's what's really fascinating.
Yes.
And as you know, Ralph, hypersonics as a flight regime, a speed regime of going anywhere from Mach 5 and higher, all the way to 2025 for reentry, vehicles. As you know, it's not a new field. I mean, you can go back to for instance, even the initial shock theory, boundary layer interactions, goes back to some of the great, masters of aerodynamics and fluid dynamics, so actually from Germany and from other parts of Eastern Europe. And so there was the knowledge, if you will, fundamentally is decades old. But what happened over the years, at least in the U.S., was the federal government had, if you will, a bit of a sinusoidal curve of how they had interest and funding for basically hypersonic research. If you remember, there was a period, during the Reagan administration, there was interest in this national aerospace plane, or the Orient Express, where we'd have high-speed vehicles that would be flying intercontinentally from a commercial perspective. But those really represented incredible challenges in terms of material technology, even the propulsion technology, etc. So there's been a lot that has happened on this front historically, and today, as you note, I mean the landscape is such that there has been a resurgence of interest in this area, and so there are significant activities that are taking place. And as you know, the U.S. is definitely pushing ahead on this front, and Lockheed Martin is the leader in basically helping our government customers in this area. What I would point out, though, since you mentioned the background, what is interesting is from a technology perspective, you have this very interesting, if you will, merging, if you will, of a B-52, which is a test airplane that the Air Force and NASA uses for these flights, and it goes all the way back to the 50s and the 60s, and yet you have a modern missile now that is being tested. What I find interesting from a technology perspective is that B-52 bomber was, designed with, like the use of slide rules. And what's interesting from an engineering perspective is that when you did that sort of very basic engineering, you put all of these design factors and safety margins in. And so today we can use an airplane that is, look how old it is. It's going to be, over 50 years old, where you have pilots that look in the pilot logbook and they're like their grandfathers that, flew the airplane. But that's because, you're able to have something that really has a lot of room for growth. And now today we have very highly optimized systems. And so it's this interesting interplay between these two sort of generational approaches to technology that I still think is going to be fascinating for how technology moves forward.
I come back. I come back to the what should I say, to the government's situation as technology takes off, space takes off, and I'm not so sure, but perhaps for you a little bit difficult in this what's technology-rich and space asset-rich United States, thinking of the situation in Europe that is not so much so rich in space assets and space capabilities, and we have many countries here that are not so big. And in principle, look what's important for us in space. So how should we position? How can we line up? What can we do? Just one observation I have from the past when this whole digital transformation started. I had, and I was still in the military. We got visitors that said we are much too small to go this innovation. I said just the opposite, because you're small, you're better advised to take this innovation on up front. So what is your advice, your view on this technology situation vis-a-vis space? What can smaller countries actually do to put themselves in a adequate position?
So no, Ralph, I mean, don't discount the value that Europe and smaller, countries bring to the space community. In fact, I had really the amazing experience when I starting my career. So this is almost like 26 years ago, when I actually attended, it's called the International Space University, and it's now headquartered in Strasbourg, France. And it was a multidisciplinary international university that was actually created in the U.S. by some graduate students at that time, actually. And but that university would host, the ISU would host a summer session program in a different city every summer. And so I attended actually the ISU in, of all places, Vienna, Austria. And so it brings back very fond memories of, Wiener Schnitzel on the Ringstrasse. But anyway, so I was introduced to, 100 students from 20 different countries around the world. And it just showed how so many countries, even though you're not the United States, you don't have a NASA with a $20+ billion budget, you still, space is a domain for all humanity to participate in. And there is interest, and every nation can actually play. And especially now with the emergence of smaller satellites, et cetera, CubeSats, nanosats, right? And the decreasing cost of launch, this lowers the threshold for many countries. So what I would say is that, ultimately, the European Space Agency, which is the major, entity for space activities from a pan-European perspective, and supported by, obviously, in Germany, the, DLR, these are major players, and they work with the U.S., especially with NASA, on whether it is space science, for planetary exploration, whether it is for monitoring the Earth science, whether it's heliophysics, and obviously we partner together very closely in human space exploration. Europe is a very, very important partner with the U.S.'s human spaceflight activities, and in fact, the last administration, the Artemis Accords, was a way to basically look through how can nations partner together better to really, again, keep the vision of that outer space treaty where humanity comes together for the peaceful purposes of the use of outer space. So I would say that there's a lot of interesting activity, and I'd also encourage you. There's an organization, the International Astronautical Federation, which is headquartered in Paris. Right, they're very active. They have an annual congress, and if you ever have the chance to attend, you will see a very rich, vibrant international community that basically participates in the space domain.
Putting the things we discussed together, maneuver in space. I recall, of course, Gerhard von Manstein, who developed maneuver warfare on the ground some decades ago. Now, U.S. military in principle and even presidents start talking about maneuvering in space, maneuver warfare in space. What is that? What we should comprehend by that? What is that future we are looking at?
Well, at the end, there's going to be, national security and military, considerations. As you probably well know, Ralph, as former military, there's things that are like strategy, there's doctrine, there's CONOPS, concepts of operation. All of those things, governments are going to have to develop. What I would say, what is interesting is that it's because of all of these fundamental technology investments and developments of where you're lowering the cost per launch, you're improving, propulsion, systems. You're now, basically putting together, if you will, data networks in space, etc. And as you well know, there's increasing talk about what can we do for manufacturing and mining. The term that in the U.S. is in situ resource utilization. Like how if you went to the moon, what if you used the lunar regolith? What could you extract from that from a resource perspective? What could you do to manufacture, things in space? So I think ultimately, and I'll quote, President Bush's, the last President Bush, his science advisor, Dr. Jack Marburger, when he was the presidential science advisor, and I had the honor of working for him for 3 years. He gave this speech back in 2006 and said, really this whole issue of human space exploration comes down to the question of us expanding the sphere of humanity's economic sphere of influence off planet into the solar system. And so I think ultimately, as commercial entities start to see, is there a commercial, return on investment? If we do some of these things like, manufacture or mine in space or have space hotels, etc., this whole maneuver business really is about, it's a domain of space where we can go from, low Earth orbit to geostationary orbit, or go to cislunar orbit, or go to the moon, or ultimately we go to Mars. I think it's really ultimately it's the transportation and operational infrastructure. It's the infrastructure for how we're going to do position, navigation, and timing in space, right? GPS works here and from a terrestrial Earth perspective, or the Galileo system that the Europeans have produced, or GLONASS, or Baidu. But now the question becomes is what is that infrastructure going to be is when we ultimately, 20, 30 years from now, we have, increased, traffic going to Mars. What's that infrastructure going to be? I think that's really the fundamental question that we have to, kind of think about. And again, it's going to be very interesting with an international and governmental and industry, large and small, all working together to see how that evolves.
Thank you. Very interesting perspective. Thorsten, now it's going back to you with the questions of the audience, please.
Sure. I'm Please, audience, you are highly encouraged to, or feel encouraged to send us some more questions in. We have one from, or we have two actually from Christian. Let's take those one. With that, greetings to Vienna. To turn the perspective around in the other way, how could we use space technology to make our life on Earth more resilient and safer in terms of cyber and electromagnetic? That is the first one, Robbie.
Okay, so there's cyber and then there's electromagnetic. Obviously, there's been a lot, there's entire, academic schools of thought that have written about, the value, economic value of spin-outs, right? Of spin-outs from space activities. And actually for some time, NASA actually even had a chief economist, that this is at NASA in the US that, worried about societal, economic kinds of things. And so what I would say from a technology perspective in cyber, there's going to be a rich interplay between what is done terrestrially, what is done in space. I think there's not, one domain is going to be stronger than the other. I think ultimately both are going to have to be hardened and going to take advantage of each other clearly. On the electromagnetic, side, I presume is like the electromagnetic spectrum side. So that there space, really, quite frankly, is going to benefit a lot more what happens on the terrestrial front. But I think what will benefit that happens in space back on Earth is always the fact that because getting something out of the Earth's gravity well is so expensive, that size, weight, and power, as they say, SWaP-C, size, weight, power, and cost. All of the technological developments that take place within the space community to basically make things smaller, more efficient, etc., in terms of volume and weight, I think that will come back to Earth and benefit, especially as you think about, taking things like the Internet of Things and how 5G is going to enable so many different things, and the miniaturization that space will drive, I think will definitely benefit, terrestrial activities.
Okay, thank you. The other one, also from Christian, is, and it's referring to how you started into your conversation. Is today's economic competition about access to Earth orbits and frequencies just a competition, or does it have aspects of a new Cold War? And more a comment, I would say. I think it's more than just the hobby of some weird billionaires. In fact, isn't rather a game of misuse public and national resources to increase proprietary profits and to create president's cases. So the question, I think, is about, do we see here a Cold War or a new Cold War? Would you agree on that?
Well, that's an interesting question. From a Cold War, that's the question. Cold War really involves, historically at least, nation states. I think, and then we start to bring in billionaires into the question. I think at the end of the day, the issue boils down to, I don't know what the definition of Cold War in this case would be, but it really is, I think, an issue of competition. There'll be economic competition. There will be, nation state competition. And so the question will be is that, how does all of those political economic dynamics, play out? Picking up on this issue of, a lot of the sort of the billionaires, I just point out that it's interesting that if you look at least in the United States, the origins in aeronautics, that it was essentially a lot of the billionaires or the millionaires at that time, like Carnegie's and, the Guggenheims of the world that had made their money in banking or railroads, they actually funded the academic infrastructure for aeronautics. So if you go to MIT, which I had the pleasure of going to for a number of years, the Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratory or California Institute of Technology. So it's interesting that, these philanthropists back in the early days of aviation, greatly contributed to the ecosystem. So I think at the end of the day, competition is going to ultimately be healthy to basically drive advances in technology. So, as long as it doesn't get into, contested and things where things become a little bit on the military side, but On the economic competition side, at least from a technology perspective, I think ultimately, as long as there's rules of the road and best practices that are adhered to, I think is going to be healthy for the enterprise.
I can hear clearly the ISU talking. So
Oh.
as an ISU alumni as well.
Oh,
so
okay, very good.
Another one which is not here, but it's on my list. So what is your personal view of our future in space? I mean, are coming from that end of development. So do we have a human future in space, and how will that look like?
Well, I think
taking into account the recent announcement of DARPA doing something on the moon, where everybody was jumping up immediately. So taking it to that level.
Oh, I see. Okay, so I think this question is referring to something called the DARPA Nomad program, which actually I had to write it down because it's still that is called the what DARPA called let's see, their novel orbital and moon manufacturing and mass efficient design, the Nomad program. So it's an interesting program where they're thinking about how do you essentially think about manufacturing and mining using in situ resource utilization. Now, I think at the end of the day, what I'm going to put out there is, yes, it's DARPA, but DARPA really pushes technology writ large. Let's not forget that the internet is a product of DARPA's investments, and what I think many people forget is that Dr. Licklider, who was at DARPA during the 60s and really sort of conceived sort of the ARPANET at that time, he initially called it the galactic internet or the galactic network, because he thought about, how would we, if we were going to go off planet, how would we communicate and share data across the planetary system? And it was the joke was that, DARPA does really, really hard things. He'll ask for a interplanetary, intergalactic, internet, and he knows you only get half of it, so he'll settle for having a terrestrial internet, right? So I think that is kind of an interesting, sort of a historical footnote to that. But at the end of the day, I think the future is going to be very exciting. I think there's a lot of different opportunities that are taking place on many different fronts. And it's going to be an interesting question of commercial activities within low Earth orbit, and then things that expand to the moon and beyond. But the one thing I would leave with is my personal opinion, is that ultimately for human activities off planet, I think it has to boil down to a quality of life basically a question. If you're going to live like on the moon, you're going to have to live in some bunker because you're not shielded from cosmic radiation. So you're sitting shielded all the time. Because of the lower gravity levels, you're going to have to be on a treadmill or do exercises multiple hours a day. That's an interesting question. Is that the quality of life you would like to lead? And so that's just an interesting question as we think about as humanity moves off planet. And so we still have a lot of biomedical research. One of the things we haven't talked about is the human component in space really is going to be driven by the advances we'll have to make in sort of biomedicine to be able to support humans to live in these for extended periods of time in these very harsh environments.
Okay, thank you. There's an interesting one coming in from Catherine Courtney. Thank you very much for that one. And that's about traffic management. And the entire one is, I mean, I'm just pointing out the topic that you have some time to prepare it. So I'm reading it off. So companies doesn't tend to volunteer for increased regulation and oversight. However, haven't we passed the point where we can simply rely on non-binding guidelines and voluntary compliance to ensure the safety and sustainability of space? What would a fit for purpose space traffic control system look like in your view?
Let me just complicate it for a moment. The thing is, we had I think today the message that Russia and China want to go together with the moon station. Now we know from the US example in the past that the big guy sets the rules and standards. So coming back to that, who actually would then set the standards?
Well, that is a great question. And so what I would point to is ultimately is, the question becomes is, there were certain activities that the last administration took on this front. We have a new administration with the U.S. And with the Biden administration, and I'll just point out that every administration puts out a national space policy. And so, we over the next 4 years, I'm sure the Biden administration will put out its own national space policy. But one of the enduring things that the U.S. has pushed for, working very closely with the international community through the United Nations, has been the peaceful uses of space and the ability that other celestial bodies are not going to be subject to national appropriation. And so I think there's a body of international norms that really have to be enforced, or I wouldn't say enforced, should be agreed to. And then obviously there's always a legal issue. I'm not a lawyer of how things would get enforced, but my point being that there is a historical body of best practices of international law that I think are going to continue to guide our efforts on that front. I think it's going to be very important, and going back to some of the elements that we had talked about a little bit earlier, that this sort of space policy, the space law, is going to be an ecosystem of activities that we're going to have to see move forward. And I think there are a lot of folks that want to ensure that these enduring principles that we have just referred to, like the Outer Space Treaty, etc., are going to endure. So that's all that I would comment on that front, and how that all pans out. That is ultimately for national governments to kind of see. But on the space traffic side, what's interesting, what I'll point out is, there's something you might have heard about there's something called the Space ISAC, which is the Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center. And Lockheed Martin was one of the founders of that center. And really it's about, bringing together, companies to basically share best practices. How are they going to work with the government? And that whole space traffic management model still has yet to be resolved. A lot of policy issues, collecting data, sharing data, then who takes it, takes action based upon that data. So for anybody who's out there in the space policy or space law world, these are active, research questions, and that, basically, governments are going to have to work through, over time.
As you just mentioned, the ISAC exercise earlier this year, or was it end of last year? So a few months back, I had the opportunity to be there as well in the room and have a look from the outside. Are we where we could be already, or how big is the gap to have a functional solution, to say it as friendly as I can?
Look, I know I used to work in the space policy arena very closely in previous jobs. I haven't been tracking it closely. What I would say, though, is let me point out an example that many people talk about, which is the Antarctic Treaty. 1961, look at this treaty, has actually been relatively successful in getting all these signatories together to basically for the sustainability and preservation of a place like Antarctica. And so I think the hope is that nations will come together and basically worry about the long-term sustainability of the domain of space. And so we have to worry about orbital debris. We got to ensure that, we reduce collisions between objects. And so again, that's a space policy issue, but there's also a space technology issue because, quite frankly, there really hasn't been a compelling case where a commercial entity can have a robust return on their investment if they were going to engage in something like cleaning up orbital debris, right? And so I think that's a very fascinating challenge to the international space community. Great.
Yes, I know we have a number of folks from Scotland here in the room today. So from Alan McKenna, and the question is, I want to congratulate Lockheed Martin for securing the contract of develop Scotland's first ever vertical launch site in the Shetland Islands. The prospects for galvanizing Scotland's space industry and the links to academia are very exciting. Can you tell us more about the site, the process of setting it up, and what will be launched from there? What is the specific location deemed to be valuable for Lockheed Martin's investment portfolio? Another one, are there specific military advantages to be gained from a spaceport in Scotland? And it would be I really would love to hear more on these issues. So,
okay, so I'll have to be very, so Torsten and Ralph, that's, I think, first of all, I am not read up on all of the details, and so I'm going to defer on that. All I'll say is that, you know, clearly our space company works across, you know, many international partners, and we worry about, you know, technology development for access to space, operations in space, and across a broad range of sectors. So I apologize, I do not know all those details, and so I don't want to, you know, openly talk about that, but I'm sure if there's some questions, we can come back and put you in touch with the appropriate, you know, individuals.
May I perhaps follow it up in a different sense? So I think the question was a kind of commercial, which is a good one, because I think, in fact, these launch sites for small sats have some merits and some future, and perhaps in the sense that I'm asking now, which is on on the electromagnetic spectrum operations. In fact, when you look, I was in the Supreme Allied Commander's command room when Kuwait was liberated, and the West was overwhelming good in electronic warfare assets. Since then, we got tired and overslept the issue, and found suddenly that while the Russians have full brigades capable, the US commanders have an advisor. So you see there's a difference between capabilities and on both sides. May it be that the electromagnetic spectrum has been overlooked in space as well? And what would be, in principle, the challenge we have to prepare for, and what role could have these small sats that we just touched upon in Scotland?
So Ralph, the bottom line here, when it comes to when you talk about the electromagnetic spectrum, it's just like another resource. You know, we talk about you know, our water quality, we talk about our air quality. You know, we talk about orbital debris, right? This is ultimately the electromagnetic spectrum is a shared resource across so many different, you know, shareholders. It's a public fact that the Defense Department has a electromagnetic spectrum strategy. So they're worrying about how contested the environment is. And I think the big challenge, you know, ultimately that's facing, you know, the national security community, as well as other stakeholders, is there's so many things that are going in, especially with 5G. And so it's really becomes a spectrum sharing issue, a spectrum policy issue. And there are bodies like the ITU that ultimately have, you know, are the key players, and all the countries come together. So answer to your question is that the spectrum is absolutely, you know, getting, you know, contested. And I think there are technological ways, and there are also policy ways that have to work closely together to ensure that we don't have undue interference, and that we still can conduct, you know, civil, commercial, national security operations in that space. Just think of it as the oceans. We have ways of how we're going to deal and share, and the sustainable future of oceans. The electromagnetic spectrum is a similar situation.
Excellent picture. Thank you. Back to you, Torsten. We're now running out of time. No?
Yeah. We have one last question I would point out here too, and that is from Martha. She asked, what are the ways that AI and machine learning innovations in space technology changing capabilities and advancements? I think that's a broad question you hopefully can answer.
Yeah. That's a very interesting. So, you know, in the military world, there's this term called the OODA loop. It's about how you observe, you orient, decide, and act. And I one time had a British colleague who one time said, it stands for Americans: you observe, you overreact, you destroy, and then you apologize. But the point I'm saying here is that this really is kind of the chain of activities that take place within an autonomous system. It observes, it perceives, it orients, it puts itself in terms of where it stands, it orients its environment. It basically makes some decisions on courses of action, and then it will actually act. And so if you think of a spacecraft as an autonomous system, AI and machine learning are very important across an entire chain. Whether you're sensing your environment, whether you're sensing something on the ground, object detection, all of the computer vision advancements that have been made through deep neural networks, the ability to sense anomalies on your spacecraft, to understand, is this something that's technically, is this something that is environmentally induced? Is this something that's maliciously done by a third party? AI can help, especially on the cybersecurity front, and actually Lockheed Martin has done a lot in that arena. And then ultimately, when I use the term AI-enabled autonomy, is going to be very important for autonomous operations. If you're going to do rendezvous and docking, or resupply, refueling in space, you can see that AI is going to be very, very important. And so one example are some of the things that we've done in some of our asteroid rendezvous missions, where we actually have used a computer vision system where you can actually, from a high resolution perspective, compare what a camera is seeing versus a model, and hence to do that differencing to understand exactly where you are, so you can do very precise navigation. So there's all these various applications that I think were AI and machine learning, and we're just at the tip of the iceberg. They're just like GPS. Nobody envisioned how GPS would be so fundamental in our lives. And I think in the AI and machine learning, we're in a similar situation. So that's why anybody who's doing technology, I think it's a fascinating area, and that we'll see how that all field evolves.
Great. So, Ralph, then back to you for last famous words before I do the closeout here.
Yes, first of all, I think I have to thank those who have been watching us, the Space Watchers, because it's important to have you. You make it, and it's wonderful to have you, Robbie, because this was a broad scope that we have covered, broad and deep, and you made it. So thank you very much for all your hints, answers that you gave to us. I think we really appreciate that, and look forward to see you once again here with us. Thanks a lot.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. Enjoyed it.
So then, question to my production team: can you please bring up the last slide? Thank you. So we have a few more cool events for the next 2 weeks planned for you. Next week, I will talk with Jose Achache. I know I've pronounced it in the wrong way, from Alton in Switzerland, about cyber threats in space, and that comes obviously to a very good timing, because next week there's also the CyberSat 21, the first conference on cyber technologies in Europe, are on satellites. So interesting follow-up, and if you follow us, then you would have seen potentially here and there some advertisement for this event. On the 19th, we will have our first Space Café in the Netherlands, run by Chiara and Banu, and their first guest will be Dr. Hilde Steenhuit from the Space Application Services. A week later, on the 23rd, I will talk with Darren McKnight, or Dr. Darren McKnight, about space situational awareness and space traffic management. What else I can talk with Darren about? And 2 days later, on the 25th, we start the day with the Space Café Law Breakfast with Stephen Freeland, and his guests will be Professor Tanya Masson, Swan, and PJ Blunt. In the evening on the 25th, we will have the first Space Café Young Global Talents, run by our editor-in-chief, Markus Peyer, and his first guest will be Michelle Hanlon. So all these events are online on Eventbrite already, and as always, we would like to hear your feedback, so please check in with us on Twitter, on Facebook, on LinkedIn. Don't forget to sign up to our daily and our bi-weekly newsletters, and if you like to treat yourself with something special, become a Space Watcher. Your support will help us, so take your credit card and visit our fan shop at shop.SpaceWatch.Global. And I know, but we really need your support to continue our work. Thank you all very much for your interest today, and thank you, Robbie, for your inspiring talk and being Ralph's guest. And thanks again to the entire team behind the scenes for doing their seamless job day by day, almost now week by week again. I hope you all will stay safe and healthy, and thanks for joining us. I hope to see you next week. In the meantime, visit our website, follow us on social media, and don't forget, become a Space Watcher. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All the best.